I was in room 5 and it was so cool.
Oh.
Yes.
Brad, you're the VA?
Yeah.
Can you hear and see me? Everybody that's virtual?
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Should we keep that open or close it?
Is there anyone else? Oh, yeah, Rebecca.
Oh, Rebecca.
Yeah, because it was doing like the blurry thing.
Oh, there's the thermostat. Eddie, can you put it a little warmer?
Where is it?
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
you turn toward.
Great.
Toasty in there. I see toasty. Solid 88.
My office, which used to be 90 degrees, is now like 40 degrees, and I have like rainouts right now. I am so cold.
You have to go from fans to space heaters.
I feel like they're messing with me because I complained about it so much.
Which do you prefer?
I don't even know. I mean, it was hot in there, like I was sweating. So I guess I'd rather be cold than turn on a heater, but okay, yes. No. Yes.
Robot's gonna have a screen on it that says 15, 20, or 25%.
Wait.
Yeah, I said that robot's gonna have a screen on it. It says 15, 20, or 25%.
You heard about how like it didn't work at all. Like they like showcased it and they had like humans like controlling it in the background. It was a huge scam. But I still think it's
Those
cool.
robots?
The Tesla
Those
humanoids.
robots?
This was like a huge disappointment, but I still think it's a cool picture. Okay, I'm gonna hide. Can everyone see my screen?
We can see it, but it's not in the presenter.
Yeah, okay. There we go.
Yep.
Okay, good deal. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. We're on Michigan time 1:05. Everybody I think on this call and in this room obviously knows me, I'm Kathy Goldstein, and I'm going to talk about emerging technologies in sleep medicine. Some of the things we'll talk about today, you'll probably have separate talks on, like you'll probably have a separate artificial intelligence talk. So if it leaves you wanting more, that's good. Okay, my conflicts of interest, I'm a part inventor of an app that's licensed to a company. It's not relevant for this. I am on the advisory board for Huxley Medical, which makes one of the devices that we'll talk about later. Here's our learning objectives, and here is our outline for today. And we are going to start with a primer. Okay, so first of all, most of the devices and technologies that we'll talk about in this hour are powered by artificial intelligence. So what is artificial intelligence? It is actually the broad science of machines, typically computers, conducting tasks that are typically thought to require human intelligence. And you'll often hear machine learning and artificial intelligence used interchangeably, but machine learning is actually has a specific definition. So it's a subset of AI where algorithms are actually learning from data. And they learn from data without the requirement of explicit programming commands or rules. However, humans can tell the algorithm what is important about the data. So equivalent to independent variables in statistics. When someone is developing a machine learning algorithm, they can tell the algorithm, these are the things I want you to pay attention to in the data. Machine learning is different from classical statistical modeling because you don't have to have assumptions about data structure that are intact. It has greater flexibility. Deep learning goes a step further, and it's a subset of machine learning where, in addition from learning from the data without explicit programming commands or rules, the algorithm actually defines the features. So the human doesn't tell the algorithm what's important about the data. The algorithm figures that out itself during the training process. There's different types of learning that these algorithms go through. So in supervised learning, the algorithm is learning from labeled ground truth data. So what do I mean by that? So that could be a radiologist read chest x-ray, a human scored polysomnogram. And what the algorithm is learning from that labeled data is how to predict an output. So pneumonia or what sleep stage from an input. And that would be a chest x-ray with a consolidation or an epic of scored PSG. Unsupervised learning, the algorithm is revealing novel patterns in the data without having a target output. So for example, cluster analysis is one of the commonly seen unsupervised learning techniques that you'll see. And cluster analysis will take all of this data and it'll group the data into clusters so that within the clusters, the data points are very homogeneous and similar to each other and very heterogeneous between the clusters. And these are things we are not telling the algorithm to do. It is determining these structures from the data on its own. And that's unsupervised learning, and the data doesn't have to be labeled then. Reinforcement learning is when models get either penalties or rewards based on their action, and they fine tune based on that. For applications in medicine, you'll typically see artificial neural networks. So these kind of mimic the brain neurons. So you'll have these neurons or nodes that'll mathematically transform data into output. And you can see that each neuron or node here is going to send an output to all the different neurons in the next layer. And that you'll have multiple layers here, and that's determined by the data and not humans. And then the strength of each neuron and its connections is iteratively adjusted during the training process to improve performance at whatever task the algorithm's supposed to do. Convolutional neural networks emphasize patterns that are in close spatial proximity to one another. So like image recognition, and recurrent neural networks is well suited for data that's in a sequence, like natural language processing. When we look at most AI sleep staging programs at this point, they primarily use convolutional and recurrent neural networks. And this makes sense, right? Because sleep studies have both spatial and temporal relationships. So it works really well for that. Unimodal AI is when AI systems are designed to handle one type of data. Multimodal AI are AI systems that can ingest multiple types of data, so text, images, electrophysiological data. Generative AI broadly is any AI system that instead of its goal being to predict, classify, analyze data, its goal is to actually generate content. And that could be image code, audio, and text. And the ones that generative AI that we're all most familiar with are the large language models. And these are, oh, hi, Mark. Large language models are trained on massive amounts of data. So the structure behind the large language model is this transformer architecture. And those are these humongous deep neural networks, and they utilize billions of parameters. They're massive. Large language models, for any of you that have used them, understand human language, right? It's not just NLP where it's going to predict the next word. It actually understands the human language, and it can generate text in response to new prompts that it's never been seen before. It doesn't require previous training, so it's dynamic. And it is learning continuously, and that is self-supervised. So when you have self-supervised learning, the algorithm is actually generating its own labels for the data. Yeah, it's scary. Rebecca, raising your eyebrows is correct. Okay. Generative AI does scare me. Yeah. Okay, so how are artificial intelligence algorithms developed and tested? This is, I know this seems like maybe in the weeds, but this is so important for when you're reading the literature. So I want you guys to understand this. So during algorithm development, there's one data set that's being used, and it's chopped up into 3 non-overlapping samples. So the training part of the data set, and that's where the algorithm is learning how to do whatever task that its goal is. And then it's tested on that validation set and then returned back to the training set to improve. Once you have your final model, it's tested on the test set. And the test set is data that's reserved or held out. So the algorithm has never seen that data before. Why is this important? Because machine learning algorithms learn. So they're going to perform amazingly well on data that they've ever seen. And that's why you have to test them on data that's been held out or unseen to the algorithm. Now, even that test set data that's unseen, it's still from the same data set. So that means the same collection methods, the same population. For example, PSG data with technologists making the same scoring errors and having the same artifact. So how do you make sure your algorithm, whatever it's for in medicine, is going to be generalizable to another place or another center? You have to test it on a completely independent test set. So that's another thing that you'll look for in the literature. So you'll see, for example, this algorithm was trained on the Mass General Hospital clinical data set, and then it was tested on an independent test set from X, Y, and Z. And that's something really important too when industry comes to you and it says, here's our new sleep staging algorithm, and it performs with 99% accuracy. You're going to say, was that on the test set or an independent test set that you used from another center? So you kind of want to empower you guys to have the knowledge behind that. Okay, so how do we compare how good like a new AI algorithm or a new wearable device, for example, is compared to polysomnogram? So let's imagine you've made a new wearable device and you want to know how well it predicts sleep. So scored polysomnogram by a human is what we consider our ground truth or our gold standard, or you can also call it your reference. And so the way we would assess the performance is we would have an individual who's undergoing polysomnogram that's going to be scored by a technologist, also wear the new device that's in question at the same time. And then we would look at the output of the device simultaneously with what the scored PSG epic is. And when we're creating performance metrics in this way, the state of interest is sleep. And when we think of like population, you guys are used to 4x4 tables where you have population, new test, disease versus undiseased. Instead of disease versus undiseased, we have state of interest, and here it's sleep. And the population is actually the number of epochs in the PSG, not people when you're looking at an outcome like the ability to classify sleep. So if we have an epoch of PSG scored by human as sleep, and the output of our new wearable device and its associated algorithm for that same 30-second epoch is sleep, we would call that a true positive. If the device and its associated algorithm calls it wake, that would be considered a false negative. Say we have an epoch of wake that the device and its associated algorithm calls sleep, then that would be a false positive. If the algorithm calls it wake, then it would be a true negative. And this is called an epoch by epoch analysis. And this allows us to create 4x4 tables and generate our performance statistics. So again, we have our new test, and that can be an algorithm, a new wearable device, a new home sleep study. And then we have the state of interest, or if the disease is present, and these are all the people these are the people or population. Population is epochs that have the state of interest. This little guy, there we go. And this is disease absent or state of interest absent in whatever your sample set or population is. So let's look at our performance metrics. The proportion of all samples that either the new test or model or device identifies correctly is accuracy, right? So true positives plus true negatives divided by all the samples. The proportion of actual positive samples or disease present samples that the model or new test gets correct is sensitivity. So that's A divided by A plus C. It's also called true positive rate, and in the machine learning world, it's called recall. So you'll see recall in the literature a lot, and that is the exact same thing as sensitivity, but they call it recall. The proportion of actual negative samples or undiseased samples, so these here, that the algorithm or new test gets correct is going to be specificity. So test negative, D, true negatives, divided by all all of the samples or population with disease absent or state of interest absent. The proportion of actual negative samples undiseased that the model gets wrong is obviously your false positive rate. The probability that if the model or new test gives you a positive result and that the sample truly is positive, so A divided by A plus B, that's your positive predictive value. And in the machine learning world, that's called precision. The probability that if the model or new test gives you a negative output, and it actually is negative, is going to be negative predictive value. So true negatives divided by all negative results. So D divided by C plus D. The F1 score is a harmonic mean of precision and recall. And I'll talk about that's something new that we've seen more in the machine learning world, and I'll tell you about why that's important. Okay, so when you're looking at what performance metric is the one that should be optimized when you're reading the literature, it depends on different things. So firstly, it depends on if your data set is balanced or imbalanced, and a balanced data set means there's equal numbers of samples in the positive and negative classes, right? So pretty uncommon to see a balanced data set in medicine. The other thing that you have to weigh when you're looking at the performance metrics is what kind of mistake is more costly. Is it more important to minimize false negatives, or is it more important to minimize false positives? And accuracy often is not going to be the best performance metric because of the fact that we're typically dealing with imbalanced data sets with different costs of misclassifications. So imagine you have some sham algorithm that's going to call every sample negative, and your disease state is rare. It occurs 1% of the time. If that sham algorithm goes through and calls every sample negative, the accuracy will still be 99%, right? And so that's why you shouldn't be fooled by accuracy, either from industry or white papers or even peer-reviewed publications that might cite it. Okay, so when do you want to use sensitivity or recall, as it's known as the machine learning world, in an imbalanced data set where you have low cases of the positives? Recall is going to be a better metric than accuracy because it's measuring the ability of the model or the new test to correctly identify positive or diseased cases. And you want to prioritize recall or sensitivities if you want to minimize false negatives, right? So if minimizing false negatives is the most important goal, that's when you want to optimize your sensitivity. So for example, if you have a dangerous but very treatable disease, you want high sensitivity of your new tests. So for example, like acute appendicitis, right? It's okay if you get some false positives, but a false negative would be catastrophic. So you want to optimize your recall. Now, when do you want to optimize positive predictive value or precision? That's when you really, really want to make sure that your positive predictions are correct. So for example, if you're diagnosing somebody who has a fatal disease with no treatment, if the new test, new model, new device calls a sample as positive, it better be positive, right? The F1 score that we talked about, that harmonic mean of precision and recall, this is going to give you a better global assessment of model performance than accuracy for class imbalanced data set. So when the precision and recall values are close to one another, F1 will be close to their value. And when they're far apart from one another, F1 will be similar to whichever is worse. So it gets pulled down by the performance metric that's suffering more for that model. And these are what you'll see when you are looking in the artificial intelligence literature, but also literature that's assessing new tests compared to reference gold standard. So these are very, very important metrics to understand. And okay, again, let's go back to our sleep example. That's why we're all here. So again, we have a wearable device that we are comparing epoch by epoch. So the output of the wearable device for a 30-second epoch, that the scored PSG is recorded simultaneously with what do our parameters mean. So sensitivity or recall in this setting is going to be the proportion of true or actual scored PSG sleep epochs that are correctly identified by the new test or model as sleep. Specificity is the proportion of true scored PSG wake epochs that are correctly identified by the algorithm or new device as wake. Precision is going to be the probability that if the model or the new device scores sleep, that epoch actually is sleep. Accuracy, again, is the proportion of all epochs that are correctly identified by the model or new test. So what happens in sleep? If we're doing this study with a wearable device and an individual in the sleep lab, what is most of the night in a healthy sleeper? Or just in general, sleep versus wake?
Oh, sleep.
Sleep, right? So say the algorithm that's running on your new wearable device goes through and calls every 30-second increment sleep. What is your accuracy going to be equivalent to? Your sleep efficiency, right? So accuracy is incredibly misleading when we're looking at overnight sleep in individuals for these sleep tracking devices. Okay, great. Another way that we look at performance of devices, new tests, and algorithms is something called a confusion matrix. This allows you to visualize correct classifications and misclassification tendencies. You'll see this, or you should see this, in every AI paper that you read. So we have sleep staging and AHI categorization. This is a deep learning algorithm. This is one of the Sentinel AI sleep staging papers here. It's a really nice read. And if we look at our confusion matrices in panel A and C, we have the algorithm prediction on the x-axis and human prediction on the y-axis. So let's take a look at how you read these. So the algorithm is going to call N1 sleep correctly 58% of the time. However, it's going to misclassify N1 as N2 18% of the time. It's going to call N1 as N3 1% of the time. It's going to call N1 as REM 4% of the time. And it's going to call N1 as wake 20% of the time. So you get accuracy on the diagonal and misclassification tendencies on the off diagonal. Let's look at AHI categorization. So we again have the algorithm's prediction as somebody with no mild, moderate, or severe sleep apnea. And then these are human scored PSGs, no mild or moderate or severe sleep apnea. So the algorithm gets it correct that someone has no obstructive sleep apnea 63% of the time. However, it's going to call no obstructive sleep apnea mild OSA 36% of the time, and it's going to call no obstructive sleep apnea moderate OSA 1% of the time. It's going to get mild obstructive sleep apnea correct 90% of the time, but it's going to misclassify it as no sleep apnea or moderate sleep apnea 5% of the time. So that's how you read confusion matrices, and these are really helpful. Other assessments of performance when we're comparing a new device or an algorithm to our gold standard or reference are Cohen's kappa, and that's agreement, but accounting for chance. It ranges from 0 to 1. And then again, because we're dealing with imbalanced data set and kappa is vulnerable to that, there's the prevalence adjusted bias adjusted kappa. So another thing that you want to look for in papers and if you're assessing AI software. And here are the Cohen's kappa interpretations. So below 0.2 is no to slight agreement. Then you get fair agreement at 0.2 to 0.4, and all the way down to above 0.9 is almost perfect agreement. This is the receiver operating characteristic curve, which you guys are probably somewhat familiar with already. So this is going to plot the performance of a new test or algorithm against gold standard with true positive rate or sensitivity or recall on the y-axis and false positive rate on the x-axis. And I have a picture of this lady here because receiver operating characteristic curves were used to determine what radar threats that people needed to pay attention to in World War II. So these have been around for a long time. You're looking for area under the curve, and a perfect test or a perfect model compared to gold standard will have an area under the curve of 1, or these blue dots here. A test that performs by chance will have an area under the curve of 0.5, or this red dashed line here. A and B represent cut points that are differentiating diseased or positive cases from undiseased. And if you have a situation where false alarms are highly costly, you want to make sure you choose a cut point that is going to minimize the false positive rate, even at the cost of the true positive rate of detections. That would be A. If your false positives are not very problematic, but your missed cases are highly costly, like so, for example, acute appendicitis for like a new lab test, then your cut point would be B. You want to make sure that you are not missing any cases, even if that means that your false positive rate is a little high. Okay, so all the variables we've talked about before now are called categorical variables. So every sample has to belong to a single discrete class. So sleep staging, non-REM 1, 2, 3, REM wake, sleep versus wake, wearable, light, deep, and REM sleep. Those are all categorical variables. Also obstructive sleep apnea, yes versus no, and mild, moderate, severe OSA. But also in sleep, we have a lot of continuous variables. So continuous variables are numeric quantities that have the same distance between each one. So our aggregate sleep parameters, minutes and percentage of the different sleep stages, the apnea hypopnea index or total number of respiratory events, periodic limb movement index or total number of limb movements. So you'll often see correlation used to describe performance of a new test or model or device versus gold standards when it comes to continuous variables. However, correlation is not a good test of performance. It's just the relationship between two variables like summer or like ice cream and convertibles with the top down, right? Those are going to move along together, but they're not necessarily, they don't agree, right? So there's other ways that we want to assess performance for continuous variables. And we do that with measurement error, and that's the difference between the device and reference values. It's typically operationalized as device minus referent, so that if the difference is a positive value, the device is overestimating, and a negative value means that the device is underestimating as compared to gold standard. Measurement error is split into two parts: systematic, and that is the average of the bias, so device versus reference across your study population, and then random, which is the 95% limits of agreement of the bias. And these, so I think I've already talked to some of you guys about Bland-Altman plots, but Bland-Altman plots allow you to visualize the magnitude and direction of bias or difference between device reference. And that's plotted on the y-axis against the true size of the measurement. So true size of the measurement is the referent value, which is on the x-axis. Now, not only do Bland-Altman plots allow you to see the magnitude of error as well as the direction of error, overestimates versus underestimates, they also allow you to see something called proportional bias, which means the error changes, either goes up or down as a function of the true size of the measurement. So the bias doesn't stay static, it changes based on the true size of the measurement. And so you can see that in here. So this is a wearable device compared to PSG, and we have minutes of total sleep time here. So we have the error, the difference between total sleep time from the device and the PSG on your y-axis, and then you have PSG total sleep time on your x-axis, and you can see as the total sleep time gets higher, we have a difference in our amount of error. It goes down, it becomes more negative. We also see this for WASO, deep sleep duration, and sleep efficiency. The other thing that Bland-Altman allows you to assess is something called heteroscedasticity, which is when random error or the standard deviation of bias increases or decreases as a true size of the measurement. So that's where you get this funnel. So you have greater uncertainty at different true values of the measurement. So that's why this is really important when, if you know what your Bland-Altman plots look like, for example, for a new home sleep apnea test, you know how to predict it when the patient truly has more mild or severe sleep apnea. Is it going to be an underestimate? Is it going to be an overestimate? Is it going to be an underestimate across the board? Is it going to change with the actual severity of sleep apnea? Is the AHI, this new test, going to give you more uncertain as the sleep apnea gets more severe? These are one things that you want to understand as you're using these new tests. Okay. So let's talk about some hardware. So for these emerging technologies, what kind of sensors do they include? So one of the biggest ones is photoplasmography. So photoplasmography, I don't know how many of you wear smartwatches. It's the little green light on your smartwatch is the LED source of your PPG sensor. And then there's also a photo detector. And the reason why this is on your watch is because blood absorbs light. So after systole, the peripheral blood vessels are going to fill with blood. Your blood volume is going to go up. There's going to be increased light absorbed, decreased light reflected back to the photodetector. So those changes in light absorbed versus light going back to the photodetector allow this device to measure photoplasmography, from which pulse rate, P-to-P intervals, and pulse rate variability are calculated. And this is what a PPG raw signal looks like as a cartoon. And we can see those, the P's and the PPG are proxies for the R wave, but they follow because it's measured in the periphery, right? And these pulse rate, P-to-P intervals, and PRVs are a good proxy for heart rate, interbeat intervals, and heart rate variabilities. Heart rate variability at rest in healthy individuals. Once movement is introduced, it's a little more difficult, but at rest, these are really good approximations. So why is that relevant for sleep? So during our different sleep stages, there's characteristic patterns of heart rate variability, and heart rate variability frequency domains. And when the wearable devices started to incorporate PPG, that's when we saw them go from just detecting sleep versus wake to also providing sleep stages. And we think that's based on the fact that PPG was informing the algorithms that stage sleep. The exception to this, with the Apple Watch, we know that the Apple Watch does not use its PPG data in sleep staging. It only uses motion. You can tell people that at cocktail parties if they're interested. So what are we most familiar with PPG in though? Oximetry, right? So photoplasmography has been around forever as a measurement of oximetry. So with medical grade pulse oximetry, it's obviously red and infrared wavelengths that are used. Those are sometimes used with wearable devices, or sometimes two wavelengths of green light are used. And by using two different wavelengths of light, whether it's red or green, it allows for measurement of the differences between oxygenated and deoxygenated hemoglobin light absorption. And that can estimate the SpO2 from that. Something to keep in mind is that medical PPG sensors, so medical grade pulse oximeters, are transmissive. So that means the photoplasmography light source, the LED, is across the vascular bed from the photodetector, or I should say the opposite. The photodetector is across the vascular bed from the LED light source. So you have the vascular bed between these. You're going to get a much more secure fit. With a smartwatch that is photoplasmography, the photodetector is in the same plane as the LED. It's reflective photoplasmography, and you've seen how people, especially me, wear their watch. So you obviously don't have as secure. So that is going to be a source of artifact. Okay, so you guys learned all about PAT. I don't know if it was last week or the week before from Dr. Completion. And we are going to interact with Pat a bunch today while we're reading our sleep studies and all of these exciting watch pats that we look at. Pat is not, so I know we think like this is the Pat probe. Not necessarily. Pat is derived from photoplasmography. It's just what, so the photoplasmography signal is processed into this Pat signal. The WatchPat probe, it does have the PPG in it, but the probe itself is to maintain pressure to prevent artifact in the PAT signal. So without that probe, you can have venous pooling, veno-arterial reflex vasoconstriction, respiratory and motion input, all causing artifact. So by having that probe, your ability to get an accurate PAT assessment from PPG signal is improved. Now, we're going to talk about a bunch of the new home sleep apnea tests, and you'll see that they all measure PAT, but there's no probe involved. And that's because they're just using algorithmic processing to remove the data, remove artifact from that PPG derived PAT. And you can see, so this is someone moving their hand around, their hand is still here, they're moving their hand around again. And this is their PAT derived from photoplasmography with the pressure field and without. And so you can see all of that movement artifact that's prevented by having that pneumatic probe. Other relevant components that we'll see, particularly in the wearables, but other emerging technologies. So micro electrical-mechanical MEMS accelerometers. This is the accelerometer in your phone and in your watch, and it collects acceleration data, X, Y, and Z axes, and then that data is filtered, aggregated in steps, sleep stages, etc. The MEMS gyroscope also measures rotation, so not just acceleration. There can be thermistors and thermophiles that measure temperature in these devices. Electrodermal activity sensors are thought to measure stress, and those are included in some of the wearables. And then dry EEG is obviously what it sounds like, EEG without glue. Ballistocardiography is something that's used in these devices, typically under the mattress or within mattress sleep sensors. And ballistocardiography is a very old technology that is the visual representation of body movement due to the heart ejecting blood into the great arteries. And from that ballistocardiography signal, cardiac measures, respiratory measures, and sleep stages can all be determined. And as far as sleep goes, this has been discussed as long ago as 1981 with the static charge bed. So this is from this physiology journal. This is a direct quote. For many patients, it's difficult even to sleep in these strange circumstances, and at least the normality of the sleep is often doubtful. The experiment's very expensive and troublesome, and thus sleep studies have not come into common clinical use. So these people clearly haven't had a reading day at the University of Michigan sleep lab. We know sleep studies are very common, but it does show, I mean, nearly 50 years ago, people were looking for alternatives to PSG. Okay, so moving towards the actual devices. So we'll start with our consumer facing, and by consumer facing, I mean non-FDA cleared sleep tracking devices, the ones that are wearables, which mean they're worn on our person. This is from a State of the Science paper that we wrote a couple of years ago, and we kind of divided up devices into these different categories. And so consumer grade devices are non-FDA cleared. Oh no, how do I make that go away? There we go. So consumer grade devices are things like Fitbit, Oura Ring, Samsung Galaxy watches. At minimum, these include the MEMS accelerometer and PPG. You typically can't access the raw data. You actually can get the acceleration data now from most devices. The algorithms that classify sleep stages and other things like readiness scores are typically proprietary, and the battery life is pretty short. But these are the ones that people like to own. And so how well do these work in actually estimating sleep? So this is from a review that looked at the sensitivity, so sleep, so the ability of these devices to detect true sleep, and specificity, the ability of these devices to correctly identify true wake. And we've got the Fitbit, Fitbit Charge, Fitbit Charge 2, Fitbit Surge, Fitbit Alta. This is Apple Watch with an algorithm, sleep classification algorithm developed here at University of Michigan. This is Apple Watch with the sleep classification algorithm from Pitt. And this is Oura Ring, their native algorithm, and another Oura Ring study, because this is back before Apple Watch had their native sleep tracking algorithm, which they now have. But anyway, what can we see? Very high sensitivity. So the device does not miss any epochs of sleep during the sleep period when comparing it to PSG. But the specificity is much lower, so 20% to about 69%. So it oftentimes is going to give you false positives. So scoring of sleep when it's actually wake. Why would that be? What are these devices primarily based on? Motion, right? And what do we do when we're awake in bed? We lie pretty still. So these devices misclassify non-moving resting wakefulness as sleep. And so they have high sensitivity and low specificity. And again, we talked about accuracy during these overnight performance assessment studies is typically not going to be a great measure because these are healthy subjects who are asleep most of the night. And what do we see? Super high accuracy levels that look similar to sleep efficiency in healthy individuals, right? This is a paper that came out after review was done, and we can see the same thing. Very high sensitivity. These devices capture every epoch of sleep in the overnight recording. However, they're going to misclassify. Look how low the specificity is. They're going to misclassify wakefulness as sleep during the sleep period. This is much more recent than those. This is an investigation that looked at 11 devices, and 5 of those were wearables. You can see Google Pixel Watch, Galaxy Watch 5, Fitbit Sense, Apple Watch 8, Oura Ring 3, and now we're not just looking at the 2 classification problem. We're looking at a 4 classification problem with wake, light, deep, and REM. That's how wearable devices output the sleep stages. And what do we see? We see that poor wake detection throughout, 22% to 48% at the best. So these really have not gotten that much better in detecting wake during the sleep period. So they're misclassifying it as sleep. So you can see that because you guys know how to read confusion matrices, right? So where are those, it's supposed to be calling it wake. It only does so correctly 27% of the time because it's calling it light sleep 63% of the time, at least the Fitbit Sense to us. And then for sleep staging has been kind of all over the place. So we see quite a bit of variability in the ability to assess sleep stages. And the way they do this light, deep, and REM, I'm sure you guys probably inferred this already. REM sleep is equivalent to PSG REM sleep. Deep sleep is equivalent to PSG N3. And light sleep, they take the PSG N1 and N2 and collapse it into light so they can do these studies. Wearable EEG headbands, you won't see your patients come in with this too frequently. Have any of your patients showed them data from wearable EEG? Has any of your patients showed them data from their wearable wrist-worn device or ring? Oh, they will, and they definitely will when you're in practice. We see it a lot. So you don't typically see these, but I put this one on here. This is the SleepWisp by Bell, and they got a bunch of grants from the DoD, so you'll likely see this device in the literature once they start publishing papers. There's earbuds that monitor sleep, eye masks, there's smart clothing, there's patches, there's a lot of different things you could wear to monitor your sleep. Okay. What about neurables, or things that can monitor sleep in the environment but are not physically on the, sorry, I'm just checking the time, person? So we have the Withings Sleep Mat, for example, and Sleep Tracker AI. These both use ballistocardiogram. Again, that visual representation of motion due to the heart ejecting blood. Withings Sleep Mat measures this with a pneumatic sensor. And then they also measure, in addition to the ballistocardiogram, body and respiratory motion, and then a microphone assesses snoring. Sleep Tracker AI. This is the technology that's embedded in the Tempur-Pedic mattress. This uses thin force sensors to measure ballistocardiogram, and it also measures body and respiratory movement and snoring vibration. And we can see it's the same thing, variability in the different sleep stages and poor ability to characterize wakefulness during the sleep period because it's classifying it as sleep, but it is going to probably give you a decent estimate of their sleep time or time in bed. And then this Sleep Tracker AI didn't give us too many details, but it gave you accuracy of 79% and a kappa of 0.68, which is fair for the 4 stages of sleep. Neurables use either low energy radar or radio frequency waves. So those are able to measure movement, and then that can be modeled into respiratory parameters and sleep stages. And they also measure things about the environment, which is kind of interesting. So light, sound, there's one that measures like air quality. And you can see, again, we have that low wake detection capacity, which has been, again, the story with all these motion-based sleep trackers. With the Sleep Score Max, we can see the specificity is 50%, so it's better than this one here. And high sensitivity for sleep, we have that at least for the Sleep Score Max, so going along with what we've seen with the wearable devices. Okay, what about FDA cleared sleep tracking? So we split these up into two. So we have our traditional research and clinical grade actigraphy. That's actigraphs, these legacy actigraphs. They're cleared by the FDA. They only monitor motion. The one that we use here when you do your MSLTs, the Philips Respironics ActiWatch, is discontinued, but just briefly the way that works. It has a piezoelectric accelerometer. That's a solid state accelerometer, not just that MEMS microchip. It measures motion triaxially. It gets plugged back in, downloaded to a software package, and then it's essentially a weighted sum that's looking at each 1 minute increment of data. And if the sum is above 40, it's going to score it as wake. If it's below, it's going to score it as sleep, at least on the medium threshold. And that's how you get those actigrams with the Respironics actigraph. But again, those are discontinued. And then there's some new models of these and devices that are FDA cleared both for their sleep tracking capability and also OSA diagnostics. So for example, the Balin Ring is FDA cleared for its sleep classification. Sleep Image is FDA cleared for its sleep quality. And the Empatica, which is a device that's primarily used for seizure detection at home, is FDA cleared for movement during sleep, not necessarily sleep stages. Then here's an example of one of the modern kind of wrist-worn FDA cleared devices. This is the Actigraph Leap. Its FDA clearance is in its activity, sleep, and mobility parameters. And these are the sensors that it contains. So it measures a lot of different parameters. This is an interesting device because it gives data on gait in addition to sleep and activity, obviously, and kind of respiratory parameters and cardiac parameters here. It gives data on gait and balance and also Parkinson's disease type parameters like bradykinesia score, dyskinesia score. The EEG headband that is FDA cleared and most well known is the Dream. And so you can see here there's multiple dry EEG leads embedded into this headband. So that's allowing for this device to detect things like the different power frequency spectra, slow oscillations, spindles, K complexes, anything you can extract from an EEG. This also has accelerometer in it and photoplasmography. And so all of these are data sources for its machine learning algorithm. And for each 30-second epoch, the algorithm extracts 79 features. Those go to a long short-term memory and softmax function to determine a probability for sleep stage for each epoch. And then it's going to output the sleep stage that had the highest probability. And again, we can see that the EEG-based sleep detection, sleep performance versus sleep and wake is a lot better. So we have 74% correct wake detection here. So and this is the device prediction here. So the device is oftentimes getting wake correct instead of misclassifying wake as sleep. And then you have your accuracy for N1, N2, N3, and REM, and these are pretty high except for N1, because N1, there's some difficulty misclassifying it as wake and primarily N2. And here are your Bland-Altman plots. I just wanted to show you guys these because you can now read these. So this is what I'm talking about when we're looking for heteroscedasticity and proportional bias. We see changes in the amount of error at the different values of, for example, wake after sleep onset, percent of wake during the sleep period, and wake duration. And you can see that you also have less certainty as those wake values get higher. So these devices might not work as well, for example, in an insomnia population. Okay, what about screening for obstructive sleep apnea? This has been new over the last couple of years. So the Apple Watch is now FDA cleared for over-the-counter assessment of risk for moderate to severe OSA. It is not cleared for the diagnosis of obstructive sleep apnea. And again, even though everyone's like, oh, it's because it's monitoring the oxygen and the cardiac autonomic activity from PPG, that is incorrect. The Apple Watch is only using motion to determine the risk for moderate to severe obstructive sleep apnea. And it notifies its user every 30 days if it sees consistent signs. And again, we want to look at the data here on performance. Just a caveat, this is a white paper. This is not from a peer-reviewed paper. Last time I checked, one hasn't come out, but that there might be one now I don't know about. So sensitivity of this device is 66%. So what does that mean? It's going to miss quite a few cases, right? It's going to miss quite a few cases of obstructive sleep apnea. But specificity is 98.5%. And I got to talk to their research scientists about this, and this was intentional because they did not want a bunch of people coming to the sleep clinic saying, my Apple Watch told me I have sleep apnea, when they were false alarms or false positives. So they wanted to minimize false positives. So they optimized the algorithm's specificity. So if someone has a positive alert from this, it is highly likely they have obstructive sleep apnea and they need to be evaluated. If they come to your clinic and they said, my wife made me come, my Apple Watch said I don't have sleep apnea, you could say, no, the sensitivity is very low. You definitely can have it. So we need to do a sleep study. Okay. So now you're aware of that. People do come to our clinic with these. The Samsung Galaxy Watch also is FDA cleared for over-the-counter risk assessment for moderate to severe OSA. Again, risk assessment, not a diagnosis. This is also from an FDA submission. It's not from a peer-reviewed paper, and they have a little bit more balanced sensitivity and specificity, which was also good. And if you're interested, there are papers that compare the Samsung Galaxy, the Samsung Watch outputs to PSG in regards to sleep staging, respiratory rate. They've also looked at its O2 capabilities.
And they use PPG or also use?
I don't know because I have not talked to their research scientists. I do not know what goes into their algorithm. The Withings Sleep Map, same thing. It's FDA cleared for screening for risk of obstructive sleep apnea. Again, we talked about that air bladder, that pneumatic sensor to measure ballistocardiography, as well as body movements, respiratory movements, and then the microphone to detect snoring. It uses a random forest classifier. So a random forest classifier is machine learning, where the human is going to tell the algorithm what features to learn as opposed to deep learning. So a random forest classifier first takes features from motion, cardiac, and respiratory signals and determines if the person's in bed. And it also gives an estimate of sleep versus wake. And then a convolutional neural network is used to determine the density of apnea and hypopnea events within a 5-minute time window to get an estimate of AHI and give that risk assessment. But I haven't had any patients come in with OSA risk assessments for this device, but it is also FDA cleared for screening. We can see for the receiver operating characteristic curve that looks really good. So performance is good, both in distinguishing moderate obstructive sleep apnea and severe obstructive sleep apnea from that device, at least in this 2021 study from JCFM. Okay. What about actual diagnosis? It's 154. Okay, I'm gonna fly through this. I highly recommend you guys read this paper. This is Ambrose Chang. And what kind of happened is every time we were going to the meeting, you would go to the, what is it called, Mark? The expo hall or whatever, the exposition hall, and there were like 1,000 new home sleep apnea tests. None of us had heard of them. Like people was like the Wild West. So this gentleman decided he started this process of writing a review article on the ones that have been FDA cleared so that we can know what was going on. And this is centered on non-airflow based new home sleep apnea tests. So when we get either respiratory event index, RDI, AHI, whatever they're calling it, this is a derived proxy value. It is not from how we typically score apneas and hypopneas, so similar to WatchPad. However, the benefit of these devices, these could be used for multiple nights of testing. We have all these people who their weight is changing like crazy because of the GLP-1s. So these could be very helpful. And the ones that are referred to in this article are all in adults. The PPG based, and most of these are actually using PAT derived from PPG. That's why we focused on that PAT derived signal, our Night Owl and Sleep Somnify, Bell and Ring and Sleep Image. And then there's these acoustic and effort based ones. And I'll just let you guys look at their table for that one instead of going through these. So for the PPG devices, almost all of these are going to be powered by machine learning and specifically deep learning, except for Sleep Image, which is a rule-based algorithm. This is the Night Owl device. So this is a device that is worn on the fingertip and it measures PAT from PPG, and as you can see, without the probe, and it also measures acceleration. We can see, at least from your published articles, that the performance is very, very good. And this was required by ResMed in 2021, and I haven't heard about a relaunch of this product, so I don't know what's going to happen to this. And there's also another similar one on the market from, I think it's from Korea. But again, fingertip, PAT, and accelerometer. And sleep, this is a chest patch. So there's a patch on the chest that has ECG and also acceleration. And then on the finger, there is a PPG monitor. That's where you get your SpO2 and all your cardiac autonomic parameters derived from PPG, as well as PAT. And then in the chest monitor, they also have an EKG. So you get single lead EKG as well as temperature. And again, we see these very, very high performance metrics, at least in the publication that was cited, except with a reduction in sensitivity for some reason with severe obstructive sleep apnea, which might be because it was misclassified as moderate or mild. The SomFit device. So this is a forehead device, and this again has photoplasmography from which PAT is derived. It also has 3 EEG leads, an accelerometer, and a microphone. And when the review came out by Dr. Chang, there actually was only FDA submission data, but there's now a paper on this. So we can see really good sensitivity for determining if someone has obstructive, at least mild obstructive sleep apnea, lower but good specificity. And then that sensitivity seems to drop with the higher values of obstructive sleep, or the higher classifications of obstructive sleep apnea, moderate and severe. And if we look at the area under the curve, again, you can see the red line here, that's mild obstructive sleep apnea. And that has a really high area under the curve, 0.93. And then there's a bit of a performance decrement when you look at moderate to severe in the black and the green curves. The Bell and Ring, so you can see it's worn a ring. It kind of goes across the knuckles there. It monitors photoplasmography and acceleration, and there's been a lot of papers on this, so we see very wide-ranging sensitivity, specificity, positive and negative predictive value and kappa values just based on the study, and also based on the fact that they had an algorithm update. Sleep Image, so Sleep Image is interesting because it is SAMD, which means it's software cleared as a medical device. So this software came out many, many years ago, and it was applied to EKG from polysomnogram, and it uses something called cardiopulmonary coupling to estimate sleep apnea, sleep quality. It can differentiate between obstructive and central sleep apnea. And then they came out with this ring that measures photoplasmography and acceleration. And now the software as a medical device is not only approved to be applied to EKG, but it's approved to be, or cleared, excuse me, we use the term clearance when we come to devices, not approval, but it's cleared to be applied to PPG from this ring. So now Sleep Image can be used as a home sleep apnea test in that way. I have seen patients come to me with Sleep Image reports, and you will as well in practice. The Santa device, this is from the full transparency, this is from the company that I'm on the advisory board for. So this has a patch on the chest, it has an EKG lead, and it has photoplasmography so that can be modeled as well. And it's not, the PPG here is not turned into PAT. Sleep apnea is scored entirely off the EKG and with the oximetry desaturations, and you can see their performance there. It's pretty good. And then we won't go over the acoustic, and I don't know why I have an alarm set for 2 p.m. I think I might have taken a nap this weekend. But the these devices here, just quickly, so you're familiar with this, these two use a microphone to record tracheal sounds. And then the Sunrise and Wesper are both motion-based, with Sunrise measuring jaw motion primarily, and Wesper Lab measuring respiratory inductance plasmography on the chest, as well as other parameters, as you can imagine here. So I won't go through these, sorry guys. Things to keep in mind about the HST performance metrics. They will output, okay, so you'll get FDA clearance, but the FDA clearance will be based on some parameters, and some of the parameters that these devices output we don't know their performance, right? So that's something to be cautious of. They might use cut points that are difficult to translate into clinical use. So for example, the Sunrise device has like a Sunrise RDI. It doesn't use regular cutoffs that we're used to. A lot of these, and I know we went through quickly, but I wanted to show you guys all of these, they had very high sensitivity, right? And what worries me, and a lot of them also had high specificity, but I don't know, I'm dubious that they perform that well. What if you have false positives on these? Do you think that the insurance company, once you have a positive diagnosis on this, you're going to be able to go back and say, oh, that was a non-flow based proxy device. I'm worried about the specificity. I think it might be a false positive. Can I get an in-lab PSG? They're going to say, no, patient already has OSA. So that's another problem with these. Also, we've started to see the addition of sensors and parameters in these that are not an input to the algorithm. So for example, some of these devices now, like some of the microphone-based and motion-based ones, they've slapped a pulse oximeter on them, but the oximetry data doesn't go into the sleep apnea classifier. So why is that there? So that's kind of strange. We think it's just probably familiar channels to physicians. And remember that Bland-Altman plot, so you know how the device is going to perform at different severities of sleep apnea. So for example, this is the Night Owl device. This is its Bland-Altman plot. And what can we see? We see as the average AHI goes higher, it's going to actually underestimate, right? Which is kind of opposite from our flow-based HST. And that's why it's important to look at these things. The Onera is essentially just all the same parameters as in-lab PSG, but they made them into these easy to put on patches so that this could be monitored in the ambulatory setting. I would say it's comparing apples to oranges here, and they are measuring airflow with the Onera device. We won't have time for AI PSG scoring, but I think you guys have another AI talk. And then in the AI talk, they'll probably also discuss the weaknesses, threats, and kind of considerations when we're looking at the use of artificial intelligence in sleep medicine and just medicine in general. But I'm going to stop here because I'm over time. But you guys can always walk in my office and ask me questions or email me.
That was great. Thank you, Kathy. I think there was a question from Jin Hong in the chat.
No, Apple Watches are cleared only for the risk assessment of moderate to severe OSA. So they're not cleared to track sleep. And one of the weird things about FDA clearance with all these new devices is sometimes, like we said, they'll be cleared for certain outputs, but not all of them.
Gotcha. Thanks, Kathy. And I think you might have covered it because oftentimes I see patients who come in here and says, hey, my watch says I'm not getting enough deep sleep. But I tell them, hey, this is not necessarily accurate. But I wonder, do you have data like on how good are those sleep tracking function with the Apple Watch? It's like 50-50 or?
So that, as far as I know, has not been published for Apple Watch, but for the wearable motion and PPG based sleep tracking in general, there's wide variability in the capacity to stage sleep. And so this is what I have, like a specific spiel for patients, and if people want to adopt it or change it or whatever. So I tell our patients are really smart, right? So I tell them, I'm like, do you know what deep sleep is? Do you know what REM sleep is? And I'm like, if you don't, let me tell you, or let me show you, it is an EEG construct, right? So we're taking an EEG defined thing, right? Like these terms came from EEG. It wasn't vice versa. It wasn't that we knew about REM sleep and then we measured it by EEG. It was the opposite, right? So we're taking these things that were derived from EEG and we're estimating them in the periphery, right? So these are just estimates. So, and we know that they are highly variable in how well they estimate. The other thing is we don't know the relevance of this sleep staging over time, right? Like, I don't know what it means if your deep sleep is this on one day and this on one day. And we don't have really good ways of improving one sleep stage over another, except for things like, oh, get up at the same time every day so you increase your circadian amplitude, or exercise. We know that improves slow wave sleep. So we're really not changing management when we're looking at those device-derived sleep stages. So I try and get my patients to kind of separate themselves from those by educating them in that way.
Awesome. Thank you.
Can I ask a question, Kathy? On the FDA cleared the Apple Watch, Aura, Samsung, all those things, the accuracy seemed to be high, although the your false positive, false negative, false, the true negative is on this specificity is on the lower side and sensitivity is high. Is it misleading because one of those you compared all those thing on a chart, one of the slides showing most of them were showing accuracy being more than 90%, and
Oh.
your
with
specificity
those-
is on
with-
60s, most of them.
Yeah, so so Punitha, I thought the same thing. So what Punitha, I think, is pointing out, the new home sleep studies, when you look at the performance data, a lot of them have like sensitivity and specificity above 90%. That's what you're noticing, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you really have to look carefully at those studies. You have to go to the methods section. You have to look at the population, because it's hard to believe that they perform that well. You need to look at the breakdown of the different severity, because I agree with you. I found that not very likely that they like, how is that possible, right?
Yes.
So I agree with you. And I think that the Apple Watch data, that makes more sense, right? You're typically, for anything in like statistics, you're typically like, your sensitivity is high at the cost of your specificity, right? And vice versa. And Apple Watch tuned their model so that the sensitivity was low because they really wanted to optimize specificity. And that seems a little more statistically sound. So I think that's a great pickup. You'd have to go to each individual paper to kind of look and see what their breakdown was. But I too found that somewhat surprising that those devices could all perform across the board so well. So yes, I am somewhat dubious. Thank you for bringing that up. And that also shows the point, and this is both with AI algorithms and new tests, and Dr. Kaplish does an amazing, and Sonia Schutz both do an amazing job of this. These devices need to be tested out in your own population, in your own sleep lab, prior to being deployed. And that is done here when we take on new devices.
Kathy, we now have some AI helping write notes.
Oh, Lord, yeah.
Which is, work in progress, I understand. Eager to try it out. How long do you think, and I think, aren't there some like clinical, like in radiology, where actually AI might assist like a radiologist? How far are we in sleep medicine from having AI help interpret a sleep study and generate a report, or maybe take a history, or possibly generate a plan with a clinic visit?
So I can tell you what's furthest along are the large language models. So anything that is text, audio, imaging too, but really text and audio, these things have gone off the stratosphere. So you've already talked about DAX, that's the AI scribe. It's not Dragon, it's not a transcription. It is understanding you and the patient interacting with one another. It cuts out small talk, cuts out interruptions, and it does a pretty good job. That being said, when we interview someone and write a note, it's going through a filter of a physician that understands the ICSD-3, right? That understands things like HSAT sensitivity specificity versus gold standard. And that's not something captured by DAX. So my experience with it in my clinic, it's like you have a really confident ortho year one resident rotating with you. There's a lot of words, it captures a lot of content, it's really capturing the patient voice, but there's something just not right about it, right? Like it likes to make it sound really flowery, so it swaps out fatigue versus sleepiness all the time, because it doesn't realize to us those are very different things, right? Now, what else Mark was talking about, and this, believe it or not, this stuff is already in Epic. It's just about which institution is making it go live. Epic, the same large language model, is now going to be able to code your diagnoses and queue up orders and labs for you, which is wild. So that's happening. PSG interpretation will get there. I haven't seen much in that area yet, though. And that's probably because of the complexity of the physiological signals and the fact that we have like those scoring rules. I think that's going to make it a little confusing, which is kind of good for us. But but I mean, you can imagine, right? Like the AI sleep staging and respiratory scoring models they're really good, at least in a controlled research protocol. We'll see when you deploy them in the field, but then it's going to look at cut points and try and write a note, and we're going to see, think about like when we look at hypopneas and we're like, just like today, we're like, those are not obstructive hypopneas, but it's going to see, it's going to score them as obstructive. It's going to write a report. It's going to say moderate OSA. And if you have somebody out trying to make a lot of money, I don't know if they're going to be looking at raw data. There's a lot of potential downfalls. But overall, and when you guys, I don't know how they're doing the AI talk, if I'm going to give it or it's going to be through one of the webinars, the AI sleep staging algorithms are amazing. They're better than technologist iterator reliability. They're great. The question is how does it work in the field? Right? How does it work when it has our labs artifact, right? Are we gonna have to resend back for scoring, right? It's really the implementation. But there's a lot of exciting things that are gonna go down in your career. All right, thanks everybody. You can't see me. Bye.